Hello, folks. How you doing today? Welcome to the session number three, folks. In this session, we're gonna talk about culture and language and the relationships that we can find in these two words, right? So, in this class, folks, we're going to explore the relationship between language and culture, right? As I said before, and we also see how language reflects cultural values, ways of thinking, and even how people understand reality, okay? So, by the end of the lesson, folks, you will understand why learning a language also means learning a culture, okay? So, before starting, folks, I would like to start with these two questions. What do you think about this? Let's see the first one. Have you ever noticed why some ideas exist in one language but not in another one? What do you think about this, folks? Well, folks, as you know, some ideas exist in one language but not in another one because languages are created within a specific cultures, right? And each culture develops concepts that respond to its own social realities, values, and ways of life, right? Language does not develop in isolation, folks. It grows together with the experiences of the people who speak it, right? So I don't know if you have wondered yourself about some expression in Spanish, how to be translated in English. For example, folks, in English, there are many words related to privacy and personal space, right? Such as privacy, personal boundaries, or individuals' rights. These words reflect the importance that many English-speaking cultures place on individuality and independence, right? On the other hand, folks, in Spanish, especially in Latin American context, we find strong emphasis on words like familia, as you know, the convivencia and solidaridad, right? So these concepts exist in English, of course, but they do not carry the same emotional and cultural weight, right? So this shows us that languages create vocabulary to name what is important for a culture, right? If a society needs to talk frequently about a concept, the language develops words, expressions, and meanings for it. That is why some ideas feel untranslatable. They are deeply cultural. Now, if we talk, folks, about some expressions or regionalisms that we got in our country, some of them we didn't have the right equivalents in English, right? So we need to look for the closest meaning in English to be translated, right? Okay, good. Now, let's see the second question, folks. What do you think about this one? It says, why do some cultures communicate directly while others prefer indirect messages? What do you think about this one, folks? Well, as you know, folks, people from different cultures communicate differently because communication styles are shaped by cultural norms, right? Values and expectations. Culture teaches us what is considered polite, appropriate, or effective when we speak. So there are some words, folks, that in our country we use it, but if you go to another culture, they don't exist, right? So probably they don't have the same meaning, the same value as we have in Nicaragua, right? For instance, folks, in many Latin American cultures, communication tends to be indirect and relational, right? People often relied on tone of voice, gestures, facial expressions, and shared context to understand meaning. Saying maybe can sometimes mean no, depending on the situation, right? In contrast, in low cultures such as the United States of Germany, communication is usually more direct and explicit. People are expected to say exactly what they mean, and clarity is valued over indirectness, right? So these differences, folks, do not mean that one way is better than other one. No, they simply reflect different cultural priorities, right? Miscommunication often happens when we interpret messages using our own cultural rules instead of understanding the rules of the other culture. I don't know if you have noticed or if you have experienced some of the expressions that you have heard or you have used with another people from another countries that probably they misunderstood. Okay, so now, folks, I would like to listen to you. What do you understand by culture? So, what is culture for you? So, we were discussing. Remember that we were discussing the previous class. This, right? Do we have any volunteer there? Well, folks, according to Hofstede in 2001, culture, he states that culture is the collective programming of the mind that distinguishes one group or of people from another. So, as you remember, folks, in the previous classes, we were discussing and you were mentioning that cultures, when we talk about culture, we talk about beliefs, values, customs, behaviors, and ways of interpreting the world, right? So the and this author state that culture is the collective programming of the mind that distinguishes one group of people from another one. So when we say collective programming of the mind refers to that beliefs, share values, customs, behaviors, etc., etc., right? So now let's see what is language or what do you understand by language? So what do you understand by language? How would you define language? Do we have any volunteer for this one? So you got some idea on your mind? What is language? Well, folks, according to Edward Sapir in 1921, described that language as a purely human and non-instinctive system used to communicate ideas, emotion, and desire through symbols, right? So just to be clear, folks, remember that language is not just grammar and vocabulary. Language carries meanings, values, and identity. Because remember that the language that we use in our country, so we can communicate with another cultures, with another countries, but the meaning, the values, and identity are totally different of that, right? Now let's see. Very good, folks. Now let's see. So the language and culture connection. So, what do you understand for that? How do you think, folks, that language and cultures are connected? So, do we have any volunteer for this one? If you want to express your opinion, or how do you think that language and cultures are connected? As you know, folks, as you know, that language and cultures are deeply interconnected, right? So, as we mentioned, the author, the Edward Sapir, and the definition that I was explaining to you about culture, he argued that language is a guide to social reality, right? So then this idea was later developed by with Benjamin Lee Worth in what we now call the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, right? So what is the hypothesis that Benjamin Lee Worth says? He says that language influences how people think. Language influences how people perceive reality. So his hypothesis consists on that, right? So in if we talk, folks, about high context, and let me check, and low context cultures, what do you understand for that? Well, folks, according to Hall in 1976, he stated that communication goes beyond words, right? So that's why that I was telling you that language is not just grammar, right? Languages is not just grammar and vocabulary. Languages carries meaning, values, and identity. And this other author says that communication goes beyond words. In high context cultures, meaning is often indirect and depends on the context, relationships, and nonverbal cues, right? Many Latin American cultures work this way, right? So, in contrast, folks, low context cultures such as the United States or Germany prefer direct, explicit, and clear messages, right? So, let's see an example. For example, in Latin America, there are some countries that say maybe later, so that is not clear. Probably you want to say it a no, but you're not saying directly, right? So, and if you see in the United States or Germany or another European countries, they say no directly without thinking twice, okay? Now I got a question for you folks. Everything's clear so far? Do you have any questions? Well, regarding to this, folks, vocabulary, idioms, and cultural values. So you got some idea about it? As you know, folks, vocabulary also reflects cultural values, right? English has many words related to privacy and individuality, right? While Spanish emphasizes concepts like familia, and convivencia, right? So some of the idioms that reflects cultural, we also have time flies, um, I'm on the red, some examples that we were explaining in the previous class, right? So we can also say, folks, that idioms cannot be translated literally because they are cultural products, okay? So sometimes we need to identify the cultural identity, the cultural products, so the cultural difficulties that we can find at the moment when we want to translate some expressions about it, right? Because as I said before, folks, in English sometimes there are not a direct equivalent to translate some expression in Spanish. Remember that in Spanish we have some specific expressions, regionalisms, jargons, and so on that in English we didn't have the direct equivalent for this, right? So we need to analyze the cultural values. So what we want to mean with these expressions, right? So what is the connotation, the values? What is the denotation of the word, right? As you know, folks, nowadays, and as you know, the language and cultures cannot be separated, right? Even as Cramsh in 1998 explains that learning a language also means learning the culture of its speaker. So I don't know if you remember in the previous class we were saying that when Nicaraguan people, especially young teenagers, are learning English, they know more about different cultures than ours, right? And when we ignore cultural aspects, miscommunication happens, right? Even if our grammar is correct. So, folks, to conclude, I would like to I would like to listen to you about this question. How does how does your own how does your own language reflect, right? Reflect Nicaraguan culture. So think about this question, folks. How does your own language reflect Nicaraguan culture? Think about this question, folks, and be prepared for next session. And we will be discussing this question in the next session, right? So if you didn't have any question, folks, this is gonna be the all things that we're gonna cover in this session. And bye bye. Okay.